If you've always wanted to write a book, but you weren't sure how, this video is for you. I'm going to cover everything you need to know on how to write a book without AI. We're going to go over how you can generate ideas for your novel, how you can develop your plot and outline your book, as well as the basic process for how to write your novel. So, let's say you want to write a book, but you have no idea where to start. You don't even know what you want your book to be about. There are several great ways that you can generate story ideas. If you're planning to write a book because you want to publish that book, then the best thing to do before you even write your first novel is just to practice writing. Brandon Sanderson actually says that you need to write several books before you should actually publish one. So a great way to generate story ideas is to just take your favorite novel and change one thing about that novel. For example, my favorite novel has always been The Princess Bride. Growing up, I loved The Princess Bride. Maybe the one thing that I change about that is the time period. Suddenly, it's a much different novel. There's also plenty of writing prompts out there to get all of your creative juices flowing, so don't worry about the ideation of your story. If you don't consider yourself a creative person, or you have the tendency to tell yourself, I don't have creative ideas, then try using some of those writing prompts just to see what happens. Ideas also don't have to be super complicated. You don't have to have everything thought out. In fact, recently I've been developing a short story collection. If you want to see my entire outlining process for that short story collection, you can check it out in the top right corner of the screen. The idea for that short story collection, however, came to me while I was driving, and it was just a single sentence. One diamond ring. That's it. And I was able to take that single piece of inspiration and turn it into an entire short story collection focused on revenge. Now that you've come up with an idea for your story, it's good to understand basic plot structures. So I'm going to go over some of the core elements. When you're writing your first draft, you really don't need an in-depth understanding of story structures. You just need to know what the basic points are, and there's a total of 5 of them. You have your exposition, your inciting incident, your rising action, your climax, and your resolution. And each of these 5 points focuses on different things. So the point of the exposition for the story is to establish your ordinary world. If you're familiar with the hero's journey, the ordinary world is the beginning where we establish everything that the characters already know. This is the part of the story where the world is built. So you would introduce your magic system, you would introduce some of the basic political structures of the story, as well as any interesting things that you need to know about the story and the characters. In Avatar: The Last Airbender, the exposition is that the Fire Nation is trying to conquer the world, and the Avatar, who disappeared, is the only person who can bring peace. You also establish a few things like the 4 elements and the way that the magic system works, but it really only gives us the basics. Next, you have the inciting incident, and this would be your hero's call to action as well as the crossing over the threshold. So something has to happen that draws our characters into their adventure, right? Now, the inciting incident has to do a few different things. First, it has to disrupt the ordinary world. It has to change the world as the character knows it. It also has to be irreversible. Once Harry knows that he's a wizard, he can't go back to thinking he's not a wizard. Things just make more sense to him. Furthermore, the characters have to be forced to respond, and it has to be some source of conflict. Now, the way your character responds will be based entirely on how you want the story to progress, as well as how the character, they themselves, would react. Harry initially is unbelieving, he doesn't believe that he's a wizard, and then Hagrid starts explaining all of the things that have happened to him as he's grown up that just never made sense. His hair growing back, he randomly appeared on the roof. All of a sudden, him being a wizard makes sense. Next is the rising action. And the rising action is the building blocks of your story. This is going to be the core of your story, and so it's going to take the most amount of time and the most amount of your word count. Think of the rising action as the way that the character rises to the occasion. In the hero's journey, this would be the road of trials and approaching the cave. Also, I know I'm mentioning the hero's journey a lot. If you're interested in learning more about the hero's journey, you can check out the video in the top right corner where I cover everything in detail. Now, the rising action needs to build tension. A novel is essentially a giant dopamine loop, and you're creating anticipation. And that anticipation is the rising action. So anything that interrupts that rising action shouldn't be included in the story. Now, if you're not sure how to build tension in your story, think about everything that happens in your day-to-day life that's sort of mundane, right? You have breakfast every day, you have lunch, maybe you go to the grocery store. All of that is stuff that would interrupt a dopamine loop in the story. So you really have to think about what you're putting in your story that is irrelevant. I know there's a lot of scenes that I have in my book that I have the characters just kind of walking down a hallway and they're conversing, but it doesn't really do anything for the story. So I need to either change those scenes or just cut them all together, because ultimately we are trying to get to the climax. Imagine a pot of water and you're watching it boil and you're watching it boil and you're getting excited and you just really want it to boil because you want to drink your tea. The climax is the boiling point, when you finally get that 1 degree that makes your water hot enough to boil. Now, it's important to note when you're writing a series that you're going to have different climaxes. There's going to be your overarching story, which, if we go back to our Avatar example, Aang's ultimate goal is to defeat the Fire Lord. So the climax for the entire story of Avatar is when Aang goes to fight Ozai. However, each of the different seasons has its own climax. In the first season, the Book of Water, the climax is when General Zhao. The climax is when General Zhao attacks the Northern Water Tribe. In the second season, the Book of Earth, the climax is when Azula strikes Aang with lightning. And then in the third book, the Book of Fire, the climax is when Aang actually fights Ozai. But if you look at each of the different seasons on an individual level, they each have their own plot structure. And you can even break it down even further, where each chapter and each episode also follows this same plot structure. And that's how you can create more dopamine loops in each of your chapters. And the final step in a basic plot is the falling action and resolution. And these kind of wrap up together. It is so important that you have these. In theater, there's something called the catharsis. The catharsis happens when everything is wrapped up. Now, a good story should not wrap everything up neatly with a bow, and you see this a lot in romance novels, but a good story does not have a neat ending. Horror is a genre that's especially good at this because usually horror does not have happy endings. For example, if you look at the Blair Witch Project, at the end of the Blair Witch, I'm thinking of the video game specifically, but at the end of the Blair Witch Project, you either, depending on the choices you make, your character either dies. Well, I guess either way your character dies, but the cycle is either unbroken or you become the monster and the cycle continues. But either way, you sort of have a tragic ending for your hero. If you don't have falling action and resolution, then you don't have catharsis. You could think of it kind of like the afterglow. If your novel doesn't have an afterglow, you're not going to be satisfied. You need that coming down period from that rush of dopamine. And if you want to test this theory, you could watch all the way to the end of the Stranger Things and then not watch the last episode. Just see how you feel afterwards. Now, there's a few different ways that you can outline this, and I actually have a free outlining graphic linked in the description of this video, so if you're not sure how to outline and you want a good place to start, definitely check that out. But you don't necessarily need an outline. There's different types of writers. There's discovery writers, and then there are plotters. Discovery writers are sometimes called pantsers because they write by the seat of their pants, but essentially it's how you use outlines to plan out your novels. Now, I highly recommend having at least just a basic outline. I'm a pantser, and when I try to write without an outline, I go on these super long, totally irrelevant tangents, and I get very lost in my story. There's a few different types of outlines that you can use to kind of structure your novel, and they are the pyramid structure, the staircase method, and a 3-act structure, which you can see in Baldur's Gate. If you want to know more about how you can outline your story, then definitely like this video, because if it gets 5 likes, then I'll make a video in the future all about the different outlines and which ones are my favorites. Now, there's something really important that you need to know when you're writing your first draft, and that is that you don't need to worry about perfection. In fact, that's sort of the point of the first draft, right? The first draft is just putting all of your ideas down on paper. The great thing about living in the 21st century is that there are so many resources available at our fingertips that we can use to learn and develop our skills. As you're writing your first draft, you can look up different YouTube videos like this one right here, and you can learn as you go. There's also some great books out there about outlining and story structures, and I'll have them linked in the description of this video. You may also be wondering if writing a novel is worth it even if you don't plan to publish, and let me tell you exactly why it is. 2026 is the year that people are stepping away from technology. I have seen so many different people who are trying to live asynchronously, and one of the great things about writing is that it's the perfect skill to do that. Writing is also a great way to watch your skill develop because as you edit and as you see how the novel evolves, you'll see how your writing style changes and gets better. And that in turn will build your confidence. So even if you don't plan to publish, there are still so many benefits to writing that it's totally worth doing. And it's a great way to embrace this year as you step back from technology. I'd love to hear what type of novel you're going to write down in the comments. And the last thing I want to touch on is a really serious matter for me. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that 50% of novels nowadays are written with AI. I remember someone was recommending that I read a book series, and I looked at that book series and they were releasing the new books like every 2 months or every 4 months or something, and there's just no way they could be doing that without AI. Now, the thing about efficiency is that you often lose quality. Novels that are written without AI don't have any soul in them. And you can feel that when you're reading. Everybody knows when they're reading something that's written with AI. Everybody knows when they're listening to a YouTuber who uses AI to write their scripts. Because AI is predictable. AI is based on patterns. Everything you need to write a book is right here. So if you're ready to take the next step and start brainstorming your entire book, then check out the video on the screen where I brainstorm the entire short story collection that I talked about earlier. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and I'll see you next week. Bye!